Good morning. I am Hoke Perkins. I have worked in and around the University of Virginia Library for nearly 40 years. With its robust and continuous adaptation to the needs of scholars, such as Peter Oneth, the library, I'm convinced, will be Jefferson's most enduring legacy. And it's my fancy that some conscientious librarian will watch over the treasures of our collection, such as Jefferson's own copy of the Notes on the State of Virginia, heavily annotated in many languages, the Fire Bell in the Night letter, the only complete manuscript of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, the manuscripts of William Faulkner's of As I Lay Dying and Sound and the Fury, and juvenilia of the great poet Jorge Luis Borges. Long after Monticello, the Rotunda, and probably the American Republic have crumbled into dust. We'll hope not to weep over that fact. As I near very close to the end of my time at the University of Virginia, I am more certain than ever, just as Jefferson put the library at the heart of the academical village, that librarians are the soul of the university. And so for me, there's no greater recommendation or title or credit than to be a librarian. So you can read all about the various and wonderful accomplishments and publications and work, sometimes together amongst them, sometimes separate, of our panel, but I'm just going to introduce them by saying this is Endrina of Thomas Jefferson Library, Randy Lewis Flaherty, and Jim Ambuske of the University of Virginia Law Library, and Jurretta Heckscher of the Library of Congress.
Good morning. The library that Thomas Jefferson formed for the University of Virginia was central to his vision for the institution. Does it work?
That's your laser, that's not.
Oh, sorry. All right, that works. By locating it in the Rotunda, the tallest structure and central edifice in his academical village, Jefferson placed knowledge and reason at the center and heart of the institution he founded on the illimitable freedom of the human mind. Arguably, one of Jefferson's last acts of usefulness, the university was the culmination of a lifelong pursuit of knowledge and a dedication to the practical sciences for the improvement of human society. Jefferson envisaged the university as one in which, quote, all the branches of science deemed useful at this day shall be taught in the highest degree, close quote, and where future leaders would explore and expose, quote, every subject susceptible of its contemplation, close quote. Therefore, access and exposure to recorded knowledge in the form of books and printed materials were key, and the university library was central to his plan. Housed in a structure inspired by the Roman Pantheon, the library functioned as a storehouse and repository of human knowledge and progress for students and faculty to draw upon. It was a carefully curated collection of works that reflected Jefferson's lifetime of reading and his curiosity in all aspects of the natural and material world. The fundamental value of reading was at the heart of Jefferson's enlightened vision of an educated populace. His formative experiences under the tutelage of James Maury, William Small, and George Wythe shaped his interest and his lifelong, quote, canine appetite for reading. He credited his early experiences with Maury for developing his love for the classics, and here in this slide, a small sample of Jefferson's favorite authors, many of them classical, as you can see. When asked, Jefferson would readily draw up reading lists for aspiring lawyers and other young men seeking to improve themselves. As such, providing students with access to the best books and the latest knowledge was integral to his vision for the University of Virginia. As Jefferson began to formulate his ideas for the university, the vision of his library was never far from his mind. In 1805, he expressed his intention to bequeath his personal library at Monticello. Later, in 1814, when the library and scientific apparatus of the late Joseph Priestley went on sale, he even entertained the notion that perhaps the Virginia legislature might consider acquiring his library, while also bidding for Priestley's collection in order to build such a university. 9 months later, this all changed with the War of 1812. In the aftermath of the burning of the United States Capitol, Jefferson sold his 6,500-volume library in 1815 to replace the Congressional Library that was destroyed by the British. As he reconstituted his library at Monticello, he not only formed his final collection there for his own pleasure reading, but also for its final designee. Jefferson had the university in mind as he searched for the best editions of his favorite works of history, poetry, and philology from booksellers in Paris, London, and Philadelphia. Finally, when he drew up his will in March 1826, 3 months before his death, he named the University of Virginia as the final beneficiary of his library. Amassing the library collection for the university was of vital importance to Jefferson. It was to be universal in scope and comprehensive in coverage to support an institution built on, as Roger Geiger put it, quote, an Enlightenment vision that valued breadth of knowledge, close quote. It was to be a collection that encouraged scientific and humanistic inquiry and so include the standard works and editions available at that time in history, mathematics, natural history, medicine, ethics, law, poetry, languages, and the fine arts. Some are ones he regularly included in his recommended reading list and listed in numerous discussions on university curricula over many years with individuals such as Joseph Priestley, Thomas Cooper, George Ticknor, and others. The university library's classification system was Baconian in origin, but distinctly Jeffersonian in application. It reflected Francis Bacon's organization of knowledge developed in his Advancement of Learning, and later expanded by Jean-Laurent d'Alembert in Denis Diderot's Encyclopédie. This scheme was one that Jefferson had adopted and adapted for his own sizable library at Monticello. Books were organized according to Bacon's 3 faculties of the mind, memory, reason, and imagination, which correspond to history, philosophy, and fine arts. For the university, Jefferson further divided these 3 groups into 42 subjects or chapters. The 8 professorships to be instituted at the university were grouped around these subject areas. This scheme was recorded on page 1 of an extant manuscript catalog of the library's holdings in 1825, shown here, written in the hand of John Vaughan Kane, a student appointed in March 1825 as the first librarian. After Jefferson's death in 1826, this classification system was simplified and altered such that by 1828, the 8,000 books in the library were classified into 29 chapters instead of Jefferson's original 42. The collection supported both general and professional education at the university. It was to have established and reputable works like the Encyclopédie Méthodique, often too voluminous or expensive for a private library to own, so individuals would have free access to them. It was important for students at the university to gain an understanding of how ideas and conclusions had been formed, so individuals could critically examine any assumptions made. As such, the library would not only have the best books in the respective branches of science, but also those that were, quote, deemed good in their day and which consequently furnish a history of the advance of the science, close quote. Several editions of classical authors would be available to students who could then engage in comparative study of their own. Ultimately, each chosen work should add to the library's core purpose. The collection was to be broad in scope, but far from exhaustive. With limited funds available from the legislature to build it, Jefferson had to be selective. Religious works were not excluded in the university as a secular institution. Rather, Jefferson regarded religion as a subset of ethics, which would be taught by the professor of moral philosophy as opposed to a professor of divinity. Jefferson adopted an incremental approach in building the library's collection as public funds became available and faculty came on board. In April 1824, Francis Walker Gilmer was tasked by the Board of Visitors of the university to recruit faculty and acquire scientific apparatus and books from Great Britain. He had a sum of $6,000 to acquire apparatus and textbooks needed in order for classes to begin in early 1825. Among the items on his checklist were instructions from Jefferson to attempt to procure the books needed for the Anglo-Saxon course to be taught in the School of Modern Languages. Jefferson supplied Gilmer with a book list based on familiar Anglo-Saxon titles he had previously owned and later reacquired for himself after he sold his books to Congress. To do this, he relied on three sources. One was his own manuscript catalog documenting his post-1815 library at Monticello. The second was a reconstructed manuscript catalog in the hand of Nicholas Philip Trist, detailing the books that Jefferson had sold in 1815. The last source is probably a dated bookseller's catalog from Lackington that Jefferson had obtained from a previous book order in 1821. And this explains the reference prices he was able to supply in the margin on the left for Gilmer. In mid-September 1824, armed with a budget of 800 pounds, Gilmer drew up a list of classical works to be acquired for the university by the London bookseller John Bond from suppliers in Germany, France, and London. With the help of Samuel Parr, whom George Ticknor called England's best and vainest scholar, the educated and knowledgeable Gilmer proved to be well qualified to decide which books to buy. Having graduated from the College of William Mary, he was well-read and a trained lawyer. Back in Virginia, Jefferson had been busy for more than 2 months, since June 1824, making up his own list of books for the university. When he arrived at the chapter on religion, he felt at a loss. Not knowing which divinity titles were worth including in his list, he turned to his close friend, retired President James Madison, who had been exposed to theology at the College of New Jersey or Princeton, and wrote, quote, "I wish you to suggest to me any works really worthy of place in the catalog, writers of celebrity in religious metaphysics. Pray think of it and help me," close quote. Jefferson incorporated a number of Madison's editions into his list. At the end of September, Jefferson completed his book list of 6,860 volumes, costing some $24,000, and shared it with Madison. He continued to refine it and to add to this catalog such that George Ticknor, while visiting Monticello in December, observed that Jefferson, quote, "has prepared an entire catalog of 7,000 or 8,000 volumes for the library of the university, neatly written in his own hand, arranged according to subject with an index, and priced. It must have cost him much painful and wearisome examination," close quote. In November 1824, Gilmer reported that he had successfully procured all of Jefferson's desired Anglo-Saxon volumes from Bond. Along with classics and works of modern literature, he also managed to acquire inexpensively a collection of mathematical works that he deemed superior to any he had seen in Great Britain. These books began to arrive at the university in their boxes, albeit somewhat damp, around January 20th, 1825. After unpacking the first 8 boxes with Gilmer's book catalog in hand, Jefferson was pleased and expressed his approval of Gilmer's, quote, "well-selected and well-bought," close quote, books. The rest of the Bond shipments arrived at the university in June and July of that year. These early volumes were recorded by the librarian John Kane in the manuscript catalog seen here. Faced with, quote, "the scantiness of our building funds," close quote, gifts to the university library played a vital role in building its initial collection. Shortly after university's first classes began on March 7, 1825, Joseph Coolidge of Boston, Jefferson's future grandson-in-law, presented the university with, quote, "a handsome donation of 85 volumes of classics and works on mathematics and philology from his personal library." Here is one of 2 sets of Tacitus Coolidge presented to UVA and that survived the 1895 Rotunda fire. A native Virginian living in London, Bernard Moore Carter, offered his library of 334 volumes to the university as a, quote, "testimonial of the devotion which I cherish for my native country and her interests," close quote, which Jefferson as rector gratefully accepted. Here we see the atlas, part of a 60-volume set of Charles Rollon's complete works in French with Carter's signature that is also extant at UVA. Capitalizing on these substantial gifts, the Board of Visitors placed an advertisement in April 1825 soliciting similar donations to the University Library in the Richmond Enquirer and the Charlottesville Central Gazette newspapers. In early March 1825, the Board of Visitors appointed the Boston firm of Cummings, Hilliard and Company as its agent to purchase additional books for the library. They had supplied classical books for Harvard College and other universities and published mathematical texts and books in various fields. Early in January, Jefferson had engaged Hilliard to supply cheaper editions for students to use as textbooks. And here you see in Jefferson's hand the list of editions as stipulated by the professor of ancient languages, George Long, and of modern languages, George Blademan. William Hilliard would have a maximum sum of $18,000 to acquire books from London, Germany, France, and America at a commission of 5% on a purchase price and expenses. In compiling the desiderata list for Hilliard, Jefferson consulted various print catalogs and sought the input of faculty members. As was the case for divinity, he relied on their recommendations for subject areas where his knowledge was limited. He incorporated their recommendations into his master book list while busily recording the book orders arriving from Europe as well as the gifts. In late May, Jefferson reported to Hilliard that the desiderata list was forthcoming. The catalog for Hilliard was being copied by his grandson-in-law and then personal secretary, Nicholas Trist. It was finally completed on June 2nd. Jefferson dated the catalog June 3rd, 1825, and dispatched it to Hilliard, who set about immediately to fill the university's commission. The first books from Hilliard arrived at the university at the end of June. So here you see the invoice of for the first batch from Hilliard. From among these first volumes from Hilliard, we know from early library circulation records that Jefferson was one of the first to check out volumes 2 and 3 of John Lingard's History of England a month later, on July 28, 1825. The copy you see here is the actual copy that still survives at UVA. As with the books ordered by Gilmer and supplied by Bond, these received from Hilliard were likewise recorded by the librarian John Kane in the manuscript catalog he maintained, but in a separate supplementary section at the second half of the catalog. Following Hilliard's first delivery of books in June 1825, book deliveries continued at a steady pace for the next year until after Jefferson's death in July 1826, when the original budget of $18,000 was exhausted. Order was of paramount importance to Jefferson. It was critical to him that books be available when called for. The library was temporarily located in Pavilion 7 on the West Lawn, while the rotunda was nearing completion. Jefferson appointed the first librarian, John Vaughan Kane, in March 1825 to oversee the library collection and to ensure its order and maintenance. The University Library was set up primarily as a reference collection. Jefferson insisted on a strict system of circulation. Students were allowed to borrow a book only if they had been authorized to do so by a faculty member. The numbers admitted into the library were limited so as to secure order. No student was permitted to take any book from the shelf themselves, nor were they permitted to read or consult any book without the librarian being present. When Kane faced complaints from his fellow students on the strict regulations governing the use of the library, he appealed to Jefferson to relax the circulation rules. In response, Jefferson reminded Kane that, quote, "A book misplaced is in fact lost, as nothing but accident or revision of a library book by book can ever find it again. A library in confusion loses much of its utility," close quote. Jefferson himself presented 3 books to the university, and the only one that appears to have survived is, fittingly for this conference, a volume of the Transactions of the American Philosophical Society from 1825. It has a note by him on the front flyleaf and was given by him to the university in early December 1825 on account of the plan for an observatory by Ferdinand Rudolph Hassler, published within the volume, which, quote, "will be worthy of attention," close quote, when the university was sufficiently advanced to build one. Jefferson died before construction of the rotunda was finished. He never saw the completion of all his labors, nor did he witness the library in its final home. Yet, his meticulous efforts at curating, organizing, and preserving a library collection for the University of Virginia reflected his deep commitment to its establishment. This was the institution he built with the express purpose of inculcating Republican ideals in future generations who would inherit the task of safeguarding their freedoms and ensuring the survival of the American nation. Writing to Augustus Woodward as he contemplated the end of his life and legacy a year before his death, Jefferson wrote, quote, "I'm closing the last scenes of life by fostering and fashioning an establishment for the instruction of those who are to come after us. I hope its influence on the virtue, freedom, fame, and happiness will be salutary and permanent." Thank you.
Randy and I are going to tag team this presentation, but we'd like to just take a moment and if the chair will indulge us, to recognize the fact that our colleague Gordon Hilton, who was supposed to be on this panel, is absent. And unfortunately, Gordon passed away 2 weeks ago. He was a professor of law at the university. The man knew, no one knew more about legal education at this university than Gordon. And indeed, he was actually in the midst of writing a book about that very subject at the time of his untimely passing. And so many of you knew Gordon. Many of you knew that for his pleasant demeanor, his ridiculous work ethic, and his bushy mustache, which endeared him to everyone at the law school. And Randy knew him quite well, so I'll just invite her to say a word or two. Oh, Randy says she's good. Okay. Here we go. To study the law, Thomas Jefferson wrote in 1790, "All that is necessary for a student is access to a library and directions in what order the books are to be read." Yet in the ensuing years, Jefferson modified this older notion of legal education. It reflected the colonial habit of reading law with a practicing attorney, as Jefferson had done with George Wythe or John Adams with James Putnam. Instead, Jefferson envisioned a new kind of legal education, one that took place within a university as one component of what we would now describe as a liberal arts education. Under the careful direction of their professors and through access to a comprehensive library, budding attorneys, these future American statesmen, would learn good Republican values that reflected the 17th century English Whig Constitution. For Jefferson, this project took on a greater sense of urgency in his retirement years, as he feared for Virginia and the Union's future. And so within that spirit, Randy and I want to accomplish 3 objectives over the next few minutes. We'll begin by situating Jefferson's creation of the legal part of the first UVA library within the context of how Jefferson understood early American legal history, especially the common law and his sense of the state of the Republic in the early 19th century. We'll then turn to the actual erection of that library and how Jefferson envisioned it, its use in conjunction with the legal curriculum. And finally, we'd like to briefly describe the UVA Law Library's 1828 catalog project, a digital reconstruction of that first legal library, which we're happy to publicly unveil at this conference. Jefferson's 1809 retirement from the rigors of public life afforded him the time to reflect on the state of common law and legal education in American society. Indeed, on the eve of the War of 1812, Jefferson's legal victory over fellow capital R Republican Edward Livingston invited such contemplation. Livingston had sued Jefferson in the Federal District Court of Virginia over Jefferson's presidential order directing United States Marshals to seize a small beachfront in New Orleans along the Mississippi River, to which Livingston claimed title. Confronted with the USS Chesapeake crisis in June 1807 and acting on a request from the governor of Louisiana, Jefferson sought to prevent Livingston from building a dam and other improvements that would obstruct the river traffic at a perilous moment in American international affairs. Livingston eventually sued the former president for illegal trespassing and confiscation. Jefferson's lawyers persuaded him that challenging the Virginia court's jurisdiction to hear the case was a cheaper and more efficient strategy, and they proved right. In December 1811, John Tyler, joined by all people John Marshall, riding the district circuit, acknowledged English common law precedents when they ruled that their court had no jurisdiction to hear the case, and Jefferson won. Tyler later wrote to Jefferson seeking his thoughts on certain aspects of Marshall's opinion, particularly Marshall's argument that while the decisions of British courts made since the Revolution are not authority in this country, nevertheless they are entitled to that respect which is due the opinions of wise men. Marshall's appreciation for British authority only confirmed for Jefferson what he had long suspected. Many older Americans retained affection for British legal and political culture, while younger citizens had become seduced by Tory principles. Like many of the Revolutionary generation, Jefferson revered the works of Sir Edward Coke, the Attorney General under Elizabeth I, and later Chief Justice of the Common Pleas and King's Bench under James I, whose judicial opinions eroded royal power by declaring the monarch subject to the law. Jefferson had read Coke's famed early 17th century treatise Institutes on the Laws of England during his own legal training, and for the rest of his life he championed these dense volumes as the central authority on English common law, particularly the first volume, commonly known as Coke upon Littleton. Coke's Institutes are, as Jefferson advised a young law student around 1773, a perfect digest of the law as it stood in his day. And Jefferson's response to Tyler's query reflected his own interpretation of American legal and constitutional history. He agreed with Marshall that colonists adopted and built on the state of English law at the date of our immigration, law that Coke helped to make. And that's important for Jefferson. He doubted, however, the propriety, he said, of employing English case law since that moment. Even if American jurists quoted English precedents established after the founding of Jamestown, Jefferson was clear that Republican judges had no business employing decisions made after George III's ascension to the throne in 1760. That king, he said, whose reign from the beginning was the very tissue of wrongs which rendered the Declaration of Independence necessary, presided over English courts with men such as Chief Justice Lord Mansfield. He lambasted Scottish judges' innovations or civilizations, as he called them, in the common law. He disliked Mansfield's attempt to modernize English common law and bring it in line with continental law. He despised Marshall's tendency to try to move away from established precedent, so Coke's precedents, and the decision in the Somerset case in 1772 wasn't going to help things either. But equally important, as Jefferson told Tyler, ignoring English cases after 1760 would, quote, uncanonize Sir William Blackstone and his famous commentaries on the laws of England. First published in the 4 volumes between 1765 and 1769, Blackstone sought to reduce the common law to its most basic elements. Its simplicity soon made it a favorite amongst lawyers and law students alike, much to Jefferson's lament, who believed students should consult Blackstone only after they had, he said, drawn their stores from the deep and rich minds of Coke Littleton. Blackstone's emphasis on monarchical sovereignty did not help his cause either in a Jeffersonian republic where the people reigned supreme. Contemporary events only reinforced Jefferson's animosity toward English courts and English common law. In 1814, Jefferson commiserated with a correspondent in decrying, he said, our merchants, priests, and lawyers for their adherence to England and monarchy in preference to their own country and its constitutions. The War of 1812 provoked great dissent amongst Federalists and many Americans who shared religious and economic ties with Great Britain. But Jefferson blamed the corruption of lawyers in part, he said, on the substitution of Blackstone for my Lord Coke. Blackstone, along with David Hume's History of England, he said, have made Tories of all England and are making Tories of young Americans. These 2 books had done more, he said, toward the suppression of the liberties of man than all of Napoleon's armies combined. In February 1826, Jefferson reflected on the central role Coke's philosophy ought to play at the university when he wrote to James Madison about the selection of a law professor. We must be rigorously attentive to his political principles, he told Madison, to ensure that the new faculty member held Whiggish views. Before the Revolution and before Blackstone published his commentaries and they became widely available in the colonies, he said, Coke Littleton was the universal elementary book of law students, and a sounder Whig never wrote. Coke, Jefferson believed, demonstrated deep learning on what were called English liberties. His use of the past tense to describe the state of English liberties was deliberate. Coke went out of fashion when the, he said, honeyed Mansfieldianism of Blackstone became the student's handbook. Like the apple tree in the Garden of Eden, Blackstone's commentaries offered knowledge, but at a price. In Jefferson's view, men claiming to be Whigs now sat in Congress charting the nation's future, unaware that as young men, their consumption of Blackstone had turned them into Tories. Jefferson doubted they even knew, he said, what Whiggism and Republicanism means. Fearful for Virginia and the Republic's future, Jefferson took comfort in establishing a school in which the vestal flame is to be kept alive. And now Randy will tell us that Flame required a proper library where students read Cook first, or ideally they read Cook first before they even touched Blackstone.
So just to return to Gordon for a moment, as I recently wrote about him, as a scholar, he lived in avid pursuit of the facts. And he would often write you very detailed memos whenever you asked him a question about the law school history. So today, as we sit here talking about the pursuit of knowledge, he's very much on my mind, and we hope to do him proud. But the context that Jim has set up, Jefferson's knowledge of the law and the history of the law, that certainly shaped his ideas of what legal education should be at the University of Virginia, and also shaped his ideas on what the law library should be to support that education. And in moving legal education to UVA, it moved it away from the apprenticeship system, which is how many lawyers trained, by reading with practicing lawyers, and it would solve many of the issues that Jefferson saw with that system. One would be that lawyers in training would have more time to study. He thought they would need 2 to 3 years before the responsibilities of practice would set in and distract. They could study law while also studying other topics, getting a broad education, subjects that would lay the groundwork for really a deeper understanding of the law. And the library would also provide additional resources for students to read and to learn. This would be in contrast to the very limited resources many had as apprentices, situation that really led many to rely on Blackstone. So the library would do a lot of the work of sort of uncanonizing Blackstone, to get back to what Jim was talking about, and to really counter that sort of monopoly he had over American legal education. As Endrina told us about, to acquire this library, the university hired Cummings and Hilliard. Jefferson's wish list of books, his original around 7,000 wish list, 7,000 volumes of books he wanted, included 378 law titles. He broke them down by subject: law of nations and nature, ecclesiastical law, common law, foreign law, maritime law. And he drew these books from his own knowledge, from his own library. He also used John Clark's 1819 catalog of law books. And the most important books, as he wrote to the bookseller, that he wanted them to get for this law library would be books that were commentary on English law up to James I, when the colonies broke from English legislation. And as the highest priority was, of course, the systematic arrangement of Coke's first institutes, which he said would be the elementary book of the law school. But alongside Coke, Jefferson instructed Cummings and Hilliard to purchase law dictionaries, to purchase equity case reports from the British Court of Chancery, to purchase works by Baron Geoffrey Gilbert, Richard Woodson, Francis Bacon, New Abridgment of Law. And although he had decried the seductive influence of Blackstone and Mansfield, Blackstone's commentaries in particular, Jefferson actually did include these in the library, include these in his wish list. So this was not a totally exclusionary library. It did incorporate diverse ideas within this academic framework. One quote, I sort of go back to this quote. Endrina mentioned that when young lawyers would write to Jefferson about sort of how should they pursue their study, and this one letter from the 1790s, Jefferson says, all you need to study law is a library, but also you need direction in the order in which to read those books. And so the library would really be used in conjunction with faculty lectures, in conjunction with this, with faculty guidance, within this academic framework. And I think this really gets to the point that's come up across a number of different panels. It's really started with our first panel about sort of a segregated social segregation. The ideal of that at university has moved through sort of architecture and the landscape, which is for a university really dedicated to the illimitable freedom of the human mind, and the pursuit of knowledge. This was really a managed pursuit of knowledge and really a managed landscape of learning, at least in the ideal. Another thing that we've discussed is that the ideal and the practice are not always the same here at UVA as the university opened. Just a couple examples from the law library, or the law books. Although Cook's works and works filled with similar sort of Whiggish sentiments did feature prominently in the original law library. The checkout records, the student records of what books they checked out actually show that they checked out Blackstone more often than Cook. And also, despite Jefferson's insistence that Cook be taught before Blackstone, syllabi from the 1830s show that the law professor at the time, John Davis, actually taught Blackstone first to his junior class and then taught Cook to his senior class. But at this time, Jefferson had died, and the earth does belong to the living. So, in 1828, the UVA librarian completed and published the first catalog of this new UVA library. It was roughly 8,000 volumes. Endrina touched on it as well. And there were 369 law titles in that catalog. And I'm going to jump now to conclude by just talking about a project we have at the law library. We call it the 1828 Catalog Project. And this has really been an ongoing project for about 40 or 50 years to reconstruct, it's a physical reconstruction of the law books that were listed in this catalog. These are duplicate editions, exact duplicates. We own no originals. And to date, we have 336 of the 339 titles. In the past 5-10 years, this has also moved into a digital project, and we're just going to show you just a quick tour through the website, but I really invite you to look through it on your own time and ask us questions and think about using it in the classroom or for your own research. On this site, you can see a list of all of these law titles. You can see them aligned along a virtual bookshelf. We have digital scans of the spines, so you can see how they would have appeared on the shelves. They're in the order of the 1828 catalog. You can filter them by subject, by where they were published, by other sorts of bibliographic criteria. If you want to dig deeper into individual books, you can pull them up and see metadata about them. We've scanned almost half of our collection at this point, and we are planning to scan the entire collection, so you can read through high-resolution digital scans of those books. And you can read interpretive pieces that we're continuing to add to the site on the history of the library, on the history of the law books in particular. We hope it offers not only a window into Jefferson's love of books, but a window into legal education in the early republic. Thanks.
Good morning. In a Jeffersonian spirit of improvement, I have changed the title of my paper. It's now At All Times His Chosen Companions, Some Notes on What Books Meant to Thomas Jefferson. Can you all hear me okay? I can't quite, okay. Thomas Jefferson's granddaughter, Ellen Randolph Coolidge, was in many respects his most kindred spirit in his immediate family, the one whose acuity of intellect and subtlety of reflection most closely mirrored his own. She loved him deeply and allowed him to inhabit her inner world so completely that in her later years, as she once wrote, when she dreamed, it was most often of him. It is significant, then, that when she began to describe him as she best remembered him in the years of his retirement, she thought of him first with books. Quote, "He seemed to return to private life with great satisfaction," she recalled. "His love of reading alone would have made leisure and retirement delightful to him. Books were at all times his chosen companions." Books were at all times his chosen companions. Among the millions of words that have been written about Thomas Jefferson in books, these may be among the most suggestive, not for what they say about Jefferson's intellectual life, but for what else they invite us to discover about how this man who could not live without books chose to live with them. For Thomas Jefferson, books were literal companions, a near constant physical presence that he sought to fit to his bodily needs. They were also constant instruments of human companionship, purposefully directed toward nurturing those personal relationships that most deeply nourished his own soul. Let us look more closely at what books meant to him in both these ways. When Jefferson offered to sell his great library to Congress to replace the library the British had burned, he described its creation in terms of his body and its gestures. Quote, "While residing in Paris, I devoted every afternoon I was disengaged, for a summer or two, in examining all the principal bookstores, turning over every book with my own hands, and putting by everything which related to America, and indeed whatever was rare and valuable in every science." He had little interest in books as aesthetic objects. They were instruments to be used by the mind, but also by the body. They were to be lifted and held and handled and carried and scrutinized by eye for hours on end. And in that respect, their physical identity mattered greatly. Quote, "I disclaim all pompous editions and all typographical luxury," he wrote to a favorite English book dealer, "but I like a fine white paper, neat type, and neat binding," unquote. And in matters of size, his preferences were unequivocal. Quote, "When I do not name the edition," he instructed, "never send a folio or quarto if there exists an octavo or smaller edition. I like books of a handy size," unquote. When he traveled with books, a fact that after 1786 combined with his partially crippled wrist to render his preference for octavos and duodecimos inveterate, and those are the smaller sizes of books. Eventually, he had what was in effect a traveling library of these petit format editions, which he brought to his vacation home at Poplar Forest. That many such books were pirated Dublin editions, printed beyond the reach of English copyright law, concerned him not at all. Jefferson's physical respect for books is manifest not only in the great care he took to arrange and house the volumes he owned, but in the restraint he exercised in marking them. Although he occasionally wrote brief notes in them, typically in cross-reference or correction, most of his books are marked only by his personal sign of ownership, a T in front of the letter I, which also stood for J, identifying the book's 9th group of pages, TI for TJ, Thomas Jefferson, and where there was a 19th such gathering of pages, a handwritten J after its letter T. Yet when he felt it necessary for physical comfort or intellectual convenience, he quite literally cut books down to size. As Millicent Sowerby wrote, numerous publications, quote, "issued as quartos or folios, but destined by him to be bound in octavo volumes, had their margins cut to the quick if necessary, and the leaves folded to fit the smaller covers," unquote. Likewise, binders were instructed to divide volumes into 2 parts if too large for Jefferson to hold comfortably, and to bind the 2 parts separately, unquote. Books were his chosen companions, but as with the bondspeople so essential to his life, he was willing to force them to serve. Sowerby's words remind us that Jefferson not only wrote books for publication, the Notes on Virginia, the Manual of Parliamentary Practice, 3 translations of French philosophy, and a volume of legal argument, actually in the Batur case that we just heard our speakers refer to. He also made books in a most physical sense. The best known is his Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth, those portions of the Gospels that he could accept in old age, cut from printed Bibles in 4 languages, pasted to create parallel texts, and bound. Yet there were several others. His so-called literary commonplace book, literary and philosophical passages he transcribed throughout his early life and later culled and bound, similar legal and equity commonplace books for his study of the law, and several volumes of poetry and other texts clipped from newspapers, pasted on scrap paper and assembled for his granddaughters in his presidential years. He tore apart books of Latin and Greek literature to rebind them interleaved with modern translations. He bound together scores of political pamphlets to create volumes of the history he and his peers had made, and in retirement, he gleefully showed friends tales of royal scandal, bound to make a single work on the turpitude of kings. In a culture where private manuscripts differed from printed publications across a continuum of forms, and most printed books were purchased unbound, Jefferson's physical interventions were less idiosyncratic than they would be today. Together, they disclose how deeply books companioned the whole of his life, from his youthful search for meaning, to his professional training, to his years of political combat and the balms for it he found in family and the arts, to his lifelong quest for a religion equal to the power of his mind and the demands of his heart. Not long before his marriage, when Monticello was still but modestly habitable, Jefferson invited a friend to come there and, quote, reach your hand to a library formed on a more extensive plan, unquote. He could never imagine living where his books were not in easy reach, and when his house grew big, he chose to live in the midst of his library. That spatial intimacy was matched by furniture, including a revolving bookstand that could hold 5 volumes at a time. Isaac Granger Jefferson, Monticello's enslaved blacksmith, described the practice that such a piece was meant to serve. Quote, old master had abundance of books, sometimes would have 20 of them down on the floor at once, read first one, then t'other, unquote. It has been said that, quote, Jefferson interacted with his books as if in an intellectual dialogue, unquote, but in fact, it was often less a dialogue than a consort of voices, like the chamber music he so loved. We may think of him thus, alone with his books, and so he often was. Yet it is striking how assiduously he used them to elicit human companionship across the whole arc of his life. Books were to him powerful tools of sociability and community, surpassing the constraints of space and time. That fact cannot be properly understood without bearing in mind another, that most members of Jefferson's home communities, those whose labor made possible all his life in books, were barred from access to books by law. Jefferson tolerated the laws breached by resourceful individuals, but made no move to undermine it for their communities at large. So Monticello was most basically an African-American village, most of whose members lived at the foot of the continent's greatest library and were forbidden to learn how to read. And only against that background can this be understood, that Jefferson used books to deepen his companionship with most, if not all, of those who mattered to him most. Such companionship stemmed from his earliest years. As boys, so family tradition recorded, he and his dear friend Dabney Carr would, quote, go with their books to the well-wooded sides of Monticello and there pursue their studies beneath the shade of a favorite oak, unquote. Carr died all too young, but the pattern their friendship discovered persisted throughout Jefferson's life. Its richest culmination came toward life's close, when he and John Adams healed their friendship through letters and then made their letters a ceaseless symposium on what they found in books. One can sometimes locate the start of a Jefferson friendship in the sharing of a book. The best-known example was an evening at Monticello in the waning months of the Revolution, when the host and his French visitor, quote, happened to speak of the poetry of Ossian, which was really the poetry of James McPherson, but never mind. It was a spark of electricity which passed rapidly from one to the other, this guest remembered. We recalled the passages of those sublime poems which had particularly struck us, and we recited them. Soon, the book was brought forth and placed beside the bowl of punch. And before we realized it, book and bowl carried us far into the night, unquote. As Jefferson's fame grew, so did his public image as a man of books. Many authors shared their books with him in hopes of a profitable endorsement, a request that he rarely indulged. Quote, I thank you for the pamphlets you have been so kind as to send me, he told one such applicant in 1825, but I cannot comply with your request to give my opinion of them. Against this, I have been obliged to protest in every case. I should otherwise, for the last 20 years, have been constantly employed in the trade of a reviewer of books, for which I have neither taste, talent, nor time. No mail comes without bringing me more than I could review before the arrival of the next, unquote. Far more valued were the many books he received from scientific, literary, and political luminaries who sought his opinion as an intellectual peer. These opportunities he cherished, and whether or not the writer was a personal friend already, they often occasioned an exchange of ideas that nurtured ties of friendship and respect. Among these correspondents were men and a few women, such as Joel Barlow, Pierre Samuel Dupont de Nemours, Thomas Paine, Joseph Priestley, Benjamin Waterhouse, and Francis Wright. One gift of this sort exemplifies the way that Jefferson used books to extend and strengthen the bonds of sociability. In 1807, his friend, the French writer and salonière Madame de Staël, sent him a copy of her novel, Corinne. Later that year, Jefferson loaned it to Lord David Erskine, the British minister in Washington, and Sir Augustus John Foster, secretary to the British legation. Erskine returned the book a few weeks later, apparently so that Jefferson could lend it to the wife of his friend William Thornton, the architect of the U.S. Capitol. Jefferson's library may have been, as another friend said, his private inner sanctum, but he took pride in displaying it to friends and was consistently generous in loaning his books to others, in full knowledge that they might never be returned. As he implored a young man in 1790, quote, "The losses I have sustained by lending my books will be my apology to you for asking your particular attention to the replacing them in the presses as fast as you finish them, and not to lend them to anybody else," unquote. Still, a quarter century later, as he prepared his library for Congress, he had to retrieve volumes from as far afield as Richmond, Philadelphia, and Washington itself. Jefferson not only shared his library with others, he guided others to fashion their own. From young manhood through old age, he advised dozens of friends on what books they should read, on what books they should ensure that their children read, particularly as formal courses of study, and most especially for education in the law. Indeed, he came to believe that for the dedicated student in the first stage of knowledge, books could make teachers superfluous, for, quote, "We have now such excellent elementary books in every branch of science as to make every subject as plain as a teacher can make it," unquote. The number of personal libraries built from his advice can never be known, but he left the people of his state and nation two great institutional libraries founded by his design, the University of Virginia Library and the Library of Congress. Throughout his life, Jefferson also bought books for other people, either at their request or on his own initiative. He enlisted a host of European friends and acquaintances to help him build his incomparable collection, yet the number of book acquisition tasks he undertook for others greatly exceeded his own requests. One such task changed the course of history. Quote, "I have had leisure to review the literary cargo for which I am so much indebted to your friendship," James Madison wrote him in 1786. "The collection is perfectly to my mind," unquote. When Madison went to Philadelphia the following year, those books had shaped his constitutional thought. And within the circle of his acknowledged family, Jefferson made the sharing of books both an intergenerational responsibility and an enactment of love. Quote, "Inform me what books you read," he enjoined his young daughter in his first letter to her. And his granddaughter recalled that, quote, "He interested himself in all we read," advising his grandchildren on what to read, questioning them about their reading, and sometimes, quote, "reading aloud to us from his own book some passage which had struck him," unquote. When political commitments drew him from home, another grandchild remembered, quote, "Whenever an opportunity occurred, he sent us books," unquote. And when 5-year-old Ellen learned how to read, her grandfather expressed his delight by sending her, quote, "2 little books, and if you continue to learn as fast," he assured her, "you will become a learned lady and publish books yourself," unquote. She didn't, although Lisa Francavilla has gone far to supply that want in our book literature. So important were family rituals of book-based companionship that they had a fixed place in the Monticello daily cycle. In the evenings, a granddaughter recalled, quote, "When the candles were brought, all was quiet immediately, for he took up his book to read, and generally we followed his example and took a book. And I have seen him raise his eyes from his own book and look round on the little circle of readers and smile and make some remark to Mama about it," unquote. In the end, the books Jefferson loved became his family's as well, their chosen companions no less than his own. When Cornelia Randolph visited the Library of Congress after her grandfather's death, she was overcome by the sight of, quote, "my old friends, the books. Nevertheless," she reported to her sister, quote, "I stayed and stood and thought of the time when the books were ours," unquote. Thomas Jefferson died in the suite of rooms that held his library, surrounded by the family that adored him, enslaved people who served him, and, as Ellen Coolidge noticed, quote, "his books, the beloved companions of his leisure," unquote. On the table near his bed were 4 of them, 2 political pamphlets and volumes of Aristotle and Seneca. So close, when death came, that he might almost have reached to touch them with his hand. Thank you.
We are happy to take questions, and please do use the microphones. I appreciate people handing them around. So I think the first hand is right up here, right in the green shirt in the back there. There you go. Thank you.
One of my favorite images is seeing a young student sitting at a table. The camera's on the ceiling, looking straight down. And there's open books, at least a dozen books that are open, and a student with a pad taking notes. Do you think we're reaching the law of diminishing returns with relying on computers? I'm well aware of the advantages of using a computer, but are we approaching a time when we may be thinking we're going to be able to live without books?
Well, Jim and I are two historians who work among librarians, so this is actually an active discussion. The law library wants to cut its print constantly. This is a constant discussion. How much can we cut? And I do think, I'll speak for myself. I do think that I've hit diminishing returns with a lot of the ebook options, for example. I would much rather look through a print copy. When you think about checking footnotes and you think about jumping to the index and all that stuff, I would say it's a very active conversation, and I'm nervous for it.
I would agree. Despite my title of being postdoctoral fellow in digital humanities, I'm very leery about the power of computers to erase the actual important role physical books play in our society, even despite the fact that we're building this particular book site. And here, one concrete example is that text search has been sort of become a quick and easy path to the dark side, because you immediately find the answer you think you're looking for, you consider yourself all done, and you don't look, on the other side of the pages to see what the context of that is. And, as a teacher, too, I find that a lot. With students working with digital databases or ebooks, and it's becoming a problem to help them think beyond simply that the computer finds the answer for them immediately. So I hope books never go away.
I would don't know if that's on. I would agree, absolutely. And I think your point about the fact that it takes us to one answer is actually, we really haven't begun to think through the implications of that. I do take some consolation for the fact that independent bookstores have started to flourish once again. Mm-hmm. And I think people are discovering the limits of the ebook form. At the Library of Congress, we are still struggling with the policies for collecting ebooks, which we do not at this point make accessible to people, although we're moving towards that. So I think it's in flux, but I think we all need to take part in the conversations that ought to be happening, and if they're not happening, we should insist that they take place within at least our own reach, because the policy questions and the questions of how they shape our thinking are very important, I think.
Yeah, I echo the views expressed by my fellow panelists, but I think all of us agree that Google Books and all the things that we can get access to, for example, at the Jefferson Library, we have literally hundreds of databases. And it has made scholarship, it's just made it a lot easier. I think we all can agree on that. But I think what is lost, and speaking to Chip's point, is books as objects. I think there's a lot of value. It's not just the text, even though we know Jefferson was really actually interested in the text. So we kind of, he sort of set the trend there because he didn't value so much. I mean, he did want neat bindings, but really he was interested in what was inside it, and I think we all are too. But for my own research, for my own study, I actually learned a lot from an extant Jefferson copy. I mean, in the ways that it's bound, in the ways that it's used, because where there are rare notes, whether it's in Jefferson's hand or his family's hand in the margins, very rare, but when they are there, they're actually really valuable. And you can't really replicate that. When you digitize another copy that's not his copy, you're going to miss that. And so I would say for most students today, I think there's a lack of understanding that books as objects, as part of material culture, has a lot to add to the study of it. And I have seen many books, for example, the ones in Washington University in St. Louis, the Jefferson books that were recently discovered in 2011, most of them, the original covers have been basically removed, and they're in library binding. So that was actually one of the saddest things. I think Ann Lucas and I, when we first saw them in St. Louis, we were like, oh my goodness, you know, it was kind of painful because it was in library buckram binding, and the original had been removed because honestly, the library didn't even know that they were Jefferson books. So for preservation, for use, they just thought this made a lot of sense because the original binding obviously had fallen apart. So I'm really glad that Special Collections still preserves, as far as they can, the original binding, even though the covers have fallen off, but they try to put it in protective because they recognize that that is part of that is actually part of what scholars may want to study. Yeah.
I heard a presentation by a scholar at Harvard recently who had taken her class in to look at original 18th century newspapers so that they could see what form what they were reading had come in and how people had experienced it. And the librarians lay these all out on the table, and the students came in and didn't know what they were looking at, didn't know how to pick them up and read them because they hadn't looked at a modern newspaper. On the positive side, my happiest day this spring was I had my 10-year-old granddaughter for the whole Saturday away from her intensely competitive 7-year-old sister. And I said, we'll do anything. We'll go to Monticello. We'll do this. She said, can we just read? And so we curled up one side of the sofa, me, and the other side her, and read for 6 hours. So it's I think, like artisanal beer, things could get better with younger generations.
Could the panel comment on Jefferson's views regarding novels, or particularly fiction?
Sure. I think it comes up in a letter that Nathaniel Burrell writes in 1818, asking Jefferson actually for a plan of reading for female education. I think he's most explicit there. And he actually to address a question that came up in the previous session about female education. Actually, he admitted that as at that point in 1818, he hadn't really given it systematic thought because he hadn't really thought about it, like what should they be reading. And so he said in his letter that he got input from his daughter, Martha Jefferson Randolph, and one of the little elves, which is probably Ellen, I'm guessing it's Ellen, on what what Martha had used in the education of her own children. And he went on to say, and this is interesting, that it was important for females to read because of their future roles, that they would be teaching their children and even their sons. Because he talks about how if the father is not available, he's incapacitated, he's not willing, it falls onto the mother, the female, to be able to educate their children. So part of a educated citizenry, he actually admitted, yes, it's really important. And then he goes into all the different areas in which, what should constitute that collection. But it largely came from Martha and her own experience of teaching her children. And then he talks about novels. And he says, and I think sometimes people read it as, oh, he hated novels. Actually, I don't think he does that. Actually, he's not saying absolutely no novels. And it's very clear from the letter. What he's saying is it's a poison because if youth get used to reading novels, then it would fill their minds with certain forms that would kind of corrupt them, so they're not willing to, say, read Cook, right? It's hard, it's laborious. They're looking for imaginative writing that's fictional. It's not based on fact. And I think that was one of his other arguments against novels, because they're not based on fact. But he goes on to say that in the list, he actually lists novels. And he does say that there are good ones. So he does actually list them. One is Maria Edgeworth, and he says, all good. So he approved of that. He also listed several works, Madame Jolie, I think, and Marmontel's Fables. So I think what he was trying to say is don't read that as the first. You should be reading all histories. In fact, that list had histories, it had arithmetic, it had geography, it had poetry. He's saying read that as a priority, but don't start with novels.
Just to follow up, those three books you cited, were they cited because there might be a moral lesson contained within that?
Yes, yes. And I think good writing also was part of it. Yeah.
It might interest folks to know that we had a student analyze the early checkout records of the university library, and the most checked out book was Don Quixote in the first couple of years, and probably for the reasons that Endrina just addressed, a sense of good writing and perhaps morality and ethics, but also he saw that as an effective way to learn Spanish as well.
Move over here. Yeah.
Just to add to that a bit, he did, in a 1771 letter, he recommended novels for their moral utility. He said, when you read it, it doesn't matter that it didn't actually happen. It can still cultivate your moral sense. I think partly this arose from the fact that he himself really didn't enjoy novels very much. He loved poetry. He said when he got old that he no longer particularly liked it, but actually that's not true. He didn't particularly like it in English when he got older, but he continued to love the classical Greek poetry. And I think his perhaps disdain for novels comes partly from his personal taste. But we know also that people in his family didn't follow him on that. His granddaughters read Sir Walter Scott. I believe, I seem to remember that at one point they tried to get him to read them, and he just wouldn't. He didn't.
Yeah, in fact, I think they talk about it on the way down to Poplar Forest. The carrying novels and the reading novels, and he must have been in the carriage, with them. But officially, he disapproved of it. His grandchildren did what they wanted.
It's the equivalent of them playing with their iPhones when they're in the car. So, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I have a question that's a little more speculative, asking you all to speculate, but especially maybe Endrina and Jim and Randy. I've been so struck at this conference, the persistent divide between discussions of Jefferson, discussions of the University of Virginia, and then on the other side, discussions of white supremacy, of the institution of slavery, of race. And yet, Endrina, in your paper, you mentioned the Anglo-Saxon course that was going to be developed, that is, the seeking out books for the Anglo-Saxon course. And Jim and Randy mentioned the way that the law library collected books on the law of tyranny, the topic of liberty. Can you speculate a little bit about trying to draw a bridge between these two halves of our conference and in Jefferson scholarship overall, between topics of Jefferson and UVA sort of cordoned off from those topics of race and white supremacy, and the emergence or the sort of invocation of those subjects in his book collecting or in the development of his library, given the way that books and access to knowledge really did mark a divide between parts of society and other parts of society.
I think to address that, to begin to address that, I would just go back to how, there were certain principles that he had. And so one of the things that I was looking at was, for example, for the books that he had in the first book list, so that would be not the first book list, but the Hilliard acquisition in June, whether or not it had books that perhaps promoted so-called antithetical views. And one of the complications was, for example, one of the things that he swore would never be used was Hume, right? David Hume's History of England. But then actually it ended up being in the library because it was part of Bernard Moore Carter's gift. So even though he did not prefer it, and I'll qualify a little bit later this response, but it ended up being accession. So you could argue, well, he didn't have a choice. He had to include it because it was a gift. But he also had a choice what eventually would go into the shelf. But it was recorded by John Kane, the librarian. But in the curricula, he suggested instead a Republican version of Hume, which would be John Baxter, is that right? And so that was what was put up for reading, for example. But then if you look at, and I think this is, Doug Wilson wrote an article about Hume and said that actually if you look at what Jefferson has written in other places, it's not, don't read this at all. That means he's not about banning books. He's not about burning books, which is what we will talk about today. But he says, read this first, because I want you to be formed by the correct ideas, and then go read this opposing idea so that you can see for yourself and judge for yourself what is the right view to hold. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. If you look at the law section, for example, we talked about all these works on, good Whig common law like Coke, and Algernon Sidney is in there, and, John Locke is in there, and these guys. But certainly he believed you should read those books first. And then, and only then, you read Blackstone, and then you have a better understanding of how to interpret the case reports in the library, because the library contained vast amounts of case reports put together by Lord Mansfield, by Blackstone, by Blackstone's nephew, by other people who were alive during the reign of George III. And we have a reasonably complete collection of case law from the King's reign in that collection. But you had to do it in order. And to sort of do a slight aside, one of the exciting things that we really hope someone takes up based on our project is an investigation of how slave law was taught at the university. Because if you look at student notebooks, they are teaching it as a form of property law. And that work has not been done. But we have all the notebooks if you want to come see and do an investigation of that. Oh, yeah. Go ahead.
Yes, I'm not sure, Endrina, that many in the audience are aware that you and Ann Lucas discovered the retirement library of Thomas Jefferson and found that it was at Washington College, and that includes the books, the architectural books that he used while he was designing the university. So it's a very significant recent discovery. Bob Gibson yesterday described how innovative Jefferson's medical curriculum was, and that in many ways it anticipated the standards we apply now based on the Flexner report of 1910. Was the law curriculum similarly innovative, and how important were the early graduates in terms of the Virginia bar by the sort of middle of the antebellum period? And I would like to just add an observation of just how broad Jefferson's educational vision was, that it wasn't simply limited to universities or schools, but it included museums and the importance of libraries generally. And like Franklin, he was a great advocate of public libraries and obviously supported the National Library in the Library of Congress.
In terms of graduates, I can't give you hard statistics, but we did hear yesterday, for example, about how many Virginia graduates there were in the Confederacy and higher up. So yes, I mean, Virginia was a significant school in that regard. In terms of how innovative it was, it's a little hard to answer that just because it was the law curriculum was in flux so much, and it was a constant under question about, do we teach more of a philosophical side of law or the practical side of law, and that was just sort of always changing. And in the 1830s, they start the Law Society, which brings in sort of a debating or an oratory element to law. Students somehow, resist a little bit sort of the more philosophical element. So it's always changing, and you can't quite credit Jefferson, with that's why I struggled to answer the question about sort of how innovative is it, because it's really in flux.
I mean, it's the
Yeah.
one field where it's very dogmatic. It seems to slightly go against the illimitable freedom of the human mind.
Yes, and
Yes.
we heard the first panel how there's actually a required readings for law and different for other subjects.
I think it was Jeff who told me yesterday that Anglo-Saxon was in the curriculum mainly in order to prepare to read the basis of English law. Is that right? Yeah. Yeah, so, yes.
This is a question primarily for Endrina. You talked about the books being organized under a Baconian system. What were the alternatives? What non-Baconian ways could it have been organized? And what does it tell us that Jefferson chose the Baconian system for organizing them?
So the other systems that were that had been known at the time were systems where they were organized by size or by, and one of the things that happened that at the Library of Congress, well, it didn't happen physically, but intellectually, so I didn't really go into it in my talk, but at Monticello, there were two schemes going at the same time, which is pretty fascinating. One was his sometimes analytical, sometimes chronological arrangement on paper. So and that was Baconian. What that means is that he arranged the titles by subjects, and there was a chronological arrangement, logical chronology on paper. But on the shelves, they were actually shelved by size and then subject for efficiency of space. So there were these two schemes going. But what was happening at that time, that there were books that were organized, libraries that were organized by size. But I was beginning to say that what happened to Jefferson's original analytical arrangement on paper got alphabetized by George Waterston to Jefferson's great consternation. So in other words, his catalog that was very particular that it go with the collection to Washington, D.C. in 1815, got taken and alphabetized by Waterston. And that was the original analytical order that Jefferson saw the knowledge got completely wiped out. And he was very upset, such that in 1823, he had Nicholas Tris recreate that order. And so that's called the Tris list today, and it restores that. So, but to answer your question, what does it say about him? Well, first of all, I think the idea that there was a systematic way to approach knowledge, and the basis of that was classification. And so Bacon being, three of Jefferson's, the people that he most admired, besides Isaac Newton and John Locke, that was one of the things that it helped him kind of order his environment, and that was really an Enlightenment idea, right, of ordering your environment. And he was not alone. I think Benjamin Franklin also used a Baconian-style system as well, and others as well, other planters as well with large libraries.
Okay. I'm here and then there.
No mic, so I'll speak loudly. I noticed that 4 out of 5 of the members of the panel here are wearing spectacles. And as one who has worn bifocals since I was 7, I wonder if you could comment on Jefferson's ability to continue reading even as he aged. Did he have glasses? Did he have bifocals? Did he need assistance? How did he deal with aging?
Yes, he did, actually. And it's very interesting. I think when he was in Philadelphia, and Susan, I'm looking at you here, Susan Stein, he actually ordered these frames, and I believe it was modeled after Benjamin Franklin's, yes. So he actually ordered the lenses that had different lengths, so he could fit them in as he needed them. So as his eyes aged, he would just change the lenses. So it's really brilliant, actually. But he had bifocals, yes.
Okay, I want to press you on an issue Carolyn raised before, which is it seemed the first two talks raise a fundamental tension between, on the one hand,
Excuse me, I don't think your mic.
I'm sorry.
Okay, there.
Between, on the one hand, a curriculum which is solely useful sciences for inculcating Republican ideals, a carefully cultivated collection, which is far from exhaustive. How does that relate to the illimitable freedom of the human mind? That might seem more like political indoctrination.
I agree. I think it's a tension that, as I said, I think it's come up in a number of these different panels, that as with any institution or any, curated exhibit, you're going to, the curator or the faculty member or the administrator is going to be doing some sort of, thinking of a framework in which people are going to learn. Or thinking of, as the architects think about a landscape in which learning is going to occur. So I think that is a fundamental tension, absolutely. And I think in law it played out, as I mentioned before, with tensions over sort of, are we learning practical law, are we learning philosophical law? A lot of the law students didn't stay to get their degree. They actually left early, but once they felt they had enough training. So yeah, it's a fundamental tension.
It perhaps should be said that Jefferson's understanding of freedom was based on a strong sense of discipline. And I'm not sure that he would have seen the tension that we are talking about in the way we do, because I think he would have said that in order to be truly free, there has to be a foundation in the disciplined exercise of the mind. And he was trying to cultivate that at UVA in order to enable people then to exercise their intellectual freedom throughout their lives and throughout the society. So we see it as a contradiction. I think he would see it as complementary. And in his desire to have books that had received the approbation of the ages, if possible, and so on. He was exercising a constraint that he would have seen as essential to a full development of freedom. Others may disagree, but that would be my sense of it.
Okay, one here and then you, Jeff, please.
Thank you. I would like to go back to women in education just for a moment. I seem to recall Cornelia saying how she longed to, she wished that she could attend the University of Virginia. And we look at the daughters' educations, and even that 1818 letter to Burwell, there is a substantial list, and it seems Jefferson plays a very substantial role in his granddaughters' educations. So much so they open up a school, the Edge Hill School. And so if you could address a little bit about what actually those women maybe were reading beyond novels, and were they allowed to check out books out of the University of Virginia Library?
So there are two parts. So remind me if I don't address the checking out part. So that letter is actually really fascinating because he talks about how he sees the role of Republican women, because he talks about how they should be trained, what they should be reading. He also talks about the place of the ornamental arts. So he talks about music and talks about dancing and talks about drawing and says that all of these are useful. He goes into detail. So he really is seeing them, the kind of reading or the kind of so-called training or education they're getting is related to how he saw their role in society. In fact, Nathaniel Burwell, when he writes this letter to ask for Jefferson's recommendation, talks about our situation and talking about the pecuniary situation of women. So talking about their station in life and that they don't own property, obviously, but they have some basic skills that they would function as wives, I think as mothers. And so that was what he was addressing. And when he said, he definitely had input in that list, but I think he was pretty honest. He was honest to say that I haven't really thought about this. I have not done spend much thought systematically going through what their education should be, but I've drawn it from my own family because his mentioning that Martha Jefferson Randolph had raised all her children, and she had been basically under his tutelage. So when they were in France together, we have letters, right, where he says, from this time to this time, you're going to be doing this, you're going to be reading this. So he personally supervised his daughter's education, yes, but with the intent that then they will be equipped to do the same for their own children. So I hope that
And
kind
then
of...
the checkout, yeah.
And the checkout. My understanding, well, the rules actually allow, the early rules for the use of the library allowed outsiders to come and use the library only with the, under supervision from the librarian. And I believe there is actually an account where the two granddaughters talk about visiting the library, and I think they actually did, I don't think they could actually take it out because no book was allowed to leave campus. They probably were able to see it there, but nobody could take it out. That was part of the rules. It couldn't leave grounds, basically.
Jeff?
Yeah, I really appreciate what you're doing with the law library. I think that's fantastic. And by giving a good project, you're immediately punished by people wanting more.
What can we do for you?
It kind of relates to what Endrina has been telling us. I'm curious about the actual influence of this library. You've got this great library, and you've also got these extraordinarily restrictive rules about the use of the library. And it makes me want to know more about these circulation records and how many of these books that were so valuable in standard case law were ever actually checked out, or were they checked out regularly. It's hard for me to imagine that with this kind of rules for circulation, they're really making them play a major part of actual education of the students. That also makes you want to know more about what the actual textbooks that they were buying were, because that's probably where they're doing most of their reading. And then while I'm asking for too much, looking at the database there, I would kill for you to be having another category, and the other category would be which of these books were in Sowerby, which of these books to be easily able to search for the ones that were in Jefferson's own library, both before and after the sale to Congress.
To take the first part first, the Sowerby work has been a great influence on us, and we've actually adopted some of her methodology by using Founders Online to insert quotations about particular books. But we can see down the line employing her more because it's a wonderful resource about those books. In terms of the checkout records, what we see in 1825, 1826 through about 1828, when those early records ends, is that in the first couple of years, I think it's Blackstone and Cook get checked out about 20 times each. And then you start to see those both diminish over the course of the second half of the decade. So there's probably two things going on here. One, it's entirely possible that they may not actually be checking them out, but they're maybe sitting in that library reading them. But I think the other thing that's probably happening, as Randy talked about with the syllabi, is that they become, under Professor Davis, the textbooks for the junior and senior course. And so they might actually be purchasing them on their own dime, not actually using the library in that capacity. We had our student do an analysis of those two works in particular. One of our longer-term projects is look at the case reports and things like that as well to see, how they're applying what they're reading to common law precedents.
I'll just add that I think the rules were loosened significantly after Jefferson passed, and I was trying to find it last night. I thought it was Harriet Martineau who visited the library in the 30s, but it's someone else who actually talks about when she went to go into the library and there were just students everywhere, which very much would not have been the case. So, the rules were loosened.
Yeah, in fact, when Jefferson was still alive, March 1825, I think that's when they first, yes. March 1825, the library was only open 1 day, 1 hour from 1 day of the week. And I think it's more like a staffing issue also. And then when Jefferson died in October 1826, the rule said that the library would be open every day except Sunday. So it did get, it was open, it was more accessible.
So I think we need to move to lunch, but I want to just say two more things. One is if you're interested in seeing the university after it's crumbled, and you haven't, go to Old Cabell Hall to the magnificent mural by Lincoln Perry, who is the partner of the writer Ann Beatty. And in the stairway on the right is the university in ruins, and it's taken over by vines and cardinals and wolf. It's a wonderful, wonderful image that starts in life and ends with that. And then the other is a brighter story. A new faculty, classics faculty member joined the university a few years back and came to the library because she wanted to explore our holdings in Ovid, and she was so excited to see an edition of Ovid. And so we pulled it out, and they said, please take a little more care. This was Thomas Jefferson's personal copy. She had no idea. She just wanted to see that edition of Ovid. So there's so much more to be explored in all of our libraries. And once more, a hand for the people who are doing the work. Thank you.